can find food chains in any habitat. Food chains start with plants, which use energy from the sun to make food. Small animals can feed on these plants. For example, with plenty of lettuce to eat, the number of rabbits can grow very quickly. Rabbits are good at reproducing. They have a very high birth rate. But the population can't keep on growing forever. If there are too many rabbits, then there won't be enough lettuce to go around. Rabbits can catch fatal diseases. And some just die of old age. Some rabbits will emigrate. They'll go elsewhere to look for food. And of course, some of them get eaten. Foxes are predators. They get their food by eating smaller animals. If there are enough rabbits around to eat, the fox population can grow. But foxes have their problems too. Catching rabbits isn't always easy. Foxes are hunted by humans, and some of them just die of old age or disease. And some foxes might decide to look for rabbits elsewhere. So here's the simple food chain we've been looking at. Lettuce use energy from the sun to make food. The lettuce are eaten by rabbits, so some of the energy is passed up the food chain. Rabbits also get eaten, so some energy is passed on to foxes. The species get bigger as you go up the food chain. The animal at the top of a food chain is called the top predator. Every rabbit has to eat a lot of lettuce to survive. And every fox has to eat quite a few rabbits. To show how the numbers of each species balance out, you need a pyramid. There are fewer rabbits than lettuce and fewer foxes than rabbits. Suppose for some reason there weren't as many rabbits. A change in one population can affect another. With only a few rabbits around, the foxes would have to compete harder with each other. The fox population would suffer from lack of food, or it might even die out altogether. But things might not get as bad as this. The remaining rabbits wouldn't have to compete so hard with each other for lettuce. The rabbit population could quickly increase back to normal, and then the foxes would have plenty of food. Here's a different change to think about. Suppose there was a bumper lettuce crop one year. Would that necessarily be good news for rabbits and foxes? Remember, there might be a small lettuce crop the following year. Real life is more complicated than this simple food chain. For example, foxes have to compete with birds of prey, like hawks. And foxes like to eat chickens, as well as rabbits. Rabbits are eaten by hawks, and chickens are eaten by foxes. Rabbits eat lettuce, which are also eaten by greenfly, which are eaten by ladybirds. But lettuce are also eaten by slugs, which are eaten by small birds, which are eaten by hawks, and hawks eat stoats, which eat rabbits. Oh, give in. There are lots of different food chains in any habitat. Some of them have species in common, so the chains link together to form a food web. Lake Windermere in the north of England is home to a species of fish called Arctic char. Even in daylight, it's difficult to see anything more than a few meters underwater. Instead, biologists use sound waves to count the fish population. This takes place at night, when fish do most of their feeding. The technique they use is called echo sounding. A transmitter on the boat sends waves of sound down into the lake. The sound waves reflect from individual fish, just like an echo. These echoes are then detected by microphones back on the boat. The results are recorded on tape, ready to be analysed later.
2, 1, going about.
The boat zigzags across the lake to get a complete picture of the fish population. On each stage of the journey, they count the fish in a different part of the lake. Arctic char are part of Lake Windermere's food chain, so it's important to keep track of their numbers. With a long night's work over, the results are ready to be analysed. First of all, the information on the tape is transferred to a computer. This allows the results to be displayed more easily. The bottom of the lake gives a big echo, so it shows up in bright colours. The black area is water. Each echo of a fish appears as a coloured dot somewhere in the black area. The computer can now be used to count up all the fish at different depths. Different species of fish can be told apart by their size, since a bigger fish causes a bigger echo. And fish can also be identified by their habits. The ones we're interested in are usually found near the bottom of the lake. As the name implies, Arctic char like cold water. The colder, the better. Lake Windermere was formed at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. At that time, it was much colder at Great Britain's latitude. When the ice eventually retreated north towards the Arctic Circle, the char were trapped in the newly formed Lake Windermere. That's why they prefer the cold water at the bottom of the lake. 10,000 years may seem a long time, but it isn't long enough for Arctic char to have become well adapted to the new environment. So there aren't very many of them in the lake. It's possible that they could even die out altogether. The survival of Arctic char depends on other species, so it's important to study the food chains in Lake Windermere. Arctic char feed on tiny animals called zooplankton, which can be collected using a net with a very fine mesh. These zooplankton are called Daphnia. You'll get a look at them under the microscope in a minute. Zooplankton in turn feed on algae, a type of plant life which grows in water. There are hundreds of different species of algae in Lake Windermere. So Arctic char eat zooplankton, and zooplankton eat algae. Here's the simple food chain for Lake Windermere. Algae are plants. They use energy from the sun to make food. Algae are eaten by tiny animals called zooplankton, which in turn are eaten by Arctic char. And don't forget predators. In this case, it's the pike, also known as the freshwater shark. The pike is the top predator in this food chain. It's important to keep track of all the variables which affect the species in the food chain. The temperature of the lake is monitored throughout the year, and an electronic device is used to record the amount of oxygen in the water.
Surface 23.3 degrees Celsius. 9.2 milligrams per litre of oxygen.
The underwater visibility is also important. It's related to the amount of algae in the water. You can get a rough measure by lowering a disc into the lake until it can't be seen anymore. The more algae there are, the more difficult it is to see underwater.
Meters.
So how can all this information be used to protect the Arctic char population? Here's the pyramid of numbers for Lake Windermere. If we could somehow arrange to have more algae, then there could be more zooplankton and more Arctic char. This is called a bottom-up solution to the problem. The trouble is, a massive increase in algae gives just a few more Arctic char. It sometimes happens that there is an increase in algae near sewage outlets. Properly treated sewage is harmless, and it contains a lot of the nutrients that algae need to grow. But that doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in zooplankton. There are many different kinds of algae, and zooplankton don't eat all of them. An increase in the wrong kind of algae can even be harmful to the other species in the food chain. So maybe we should try a top-down solution and declare open season on pike. This is a bit unfair on the pike, though it would seem to help the Arctic char, but life isn't so simple. Remember, a food web is more realistic. Trout also live in Lake Windermere. They eat Arctic char, but they get eaten themselves by pike. If the pike were gone, there would be more trout around to eat char, so the char population might even decrease. You have to be very careful before you start messing around with food webs. The balance of life is very complicated, and human interference can have disastrous effects. The best thing is to try to understand as much as possible about the various food chains and to interfere very rarely. For the moment, the Arctic char population is surviving. There are lots of human activities that put chemicals into the environment. For example, pesticides are sprayed directly on crops, so they have to be safe. Farmers make sure the pesticide doesn't contain poisonous chemicals called toxins. We all have to be careful with toxins, or we're just asking for trouble. What happens if toxins get into the food chain? Suppose just a few of the lettuce in the food chain become poisoned. Why can this cause havoc? Rabbits eat a lot of lettuce, so the toxins get passed up the food chain. It's very important for scientists to keep track of what's going on. It doesn't matter that only a few of the lettuce were poisoned. Rabbits eat so many, there's a good chance they'll have eaten several poisoned ones. So they get a multiple dose of toxins. This is very bad news for rabbits. Several poisoned lettuce may not be enough to kill a rabbit. But that's terrible news for foxes. A fox may eat several poisoned rabbits and get a huge dose of toxins. Because there are fewer individuals higher up the food pyramid, each animal gets a more concentrated dose of toxins. And remember, food chains are linked to form food webs, so the problem spreads all over. If humans are in the food web, we'll get a nice concentrated dose of toxins. That should teach us to be a bit more careful with toxic chemicals, especially because they take a long time to go away. Even when an animal dies, it decomposes and the toxins go into the earth. Then they get into the plants and the whole thing starts all over again.